1, 2, 1, 2, 3, Hey, my name is John Michael Swift, and I'm going to start to take you on a lesson series into what I consider to be the most sweeping and versatile guitar chord exercise that there is, and that's triad chord scales. Now, why do I say that? Well, first of all, triad chord scales are basically chord scales made up of 3 notes each, and they are literally as close together as you could pack them. The notes are very tight, so I'm going to show you what they look like a bit. They can look like that. They can also look like this. You can play them on all the strings of the guitar, and you can play them in a gajillion different ways. And what I found is these are both very easy for beginners to use, but also the guy who taught this exercise to me, Craig Ebner, is a jazz guitarist in Philadelphia. I mean, he's been playing professionally for decades, and he's still pulling things out of this exercise. And you can literally use this technique in any genre that has chords. I mean, this sees a lot of use in jazz, pop, folk, rock, reggae, classical music, blues, flamenco, metal, funk. Like literally any guitar style that uses chords is going to use chords voiced in this way. So what I find is I've kind of ordered this series to start with just teaching you the techniques and then starting to teach you some of the applications and finally getting into more of the creative stuff. But we're also going to start with the most useful chord scales. You find like the chord scales based on the major scale are the ones that see the most action. So we're going to start with those and then eventually get into maybe some other scale types. But as long as you start with the most valuable types, you're going to see your playing change completely, because these are, I think I'm going to start this video actually with explaining all the uses that I know of for these, and so you can start to understand how ridiculously versatile this technique is. So the first thing I always think of when I think of triad chord scales are what I call open string boxes, and that's really hard to kind of separate one from the other sometimes. So there's a lot of genres that have riffs that are based on, a major key, and they've got, open strings, kind of like what I was playing, kind of in the key of A, but I'm sort of playing A chords over a drone. But also, if you think of like Blackbird, that's using a lot of drone strings. The G and the D strings are open drones, and you hear a lot of songs that use things like this. That's what I call an open string box. It's in the key of E, but it's using triad chord scales on one particular set of strings, and it uses the drone strings to really bring out the color of the key. You can use it with finger picking. A doodle I wrote years ago. It's just like, it really, really brings out the color of the key. You can use it with strumming or with finger picking, but that's a very, very common technique in pop and folk music. I'll cover a bunch of songs in this series that use those techniques. A couple of songs that are fairly famous that use that are Wildfire by Michael Martin Murphy, Only Wanna Be With You by Hootie and the Blowfish, 7 Things by Miley Cyrus, Can't Help Falling in Love With You, Colby Calais. Another way that triad chord scales get used a lot is just in accompanying playing chords, but using just this voicing can have a really tight, powerful sound to it. You're going to see this a lot in rock music, in reggae, and in R&B. I mean, some examples are like the verse for Crazy Chain. That's an example of it. Any Bob Marley song is going to sound good with this. I really like to play like, Is This Love? Like any reggae song where you just kind of... this easy reggae texture to do, sounds really good, especially in this area of the neck on the top 3 strings. Another more recent example from funk is the Get Lucky. A lot of funk guitar lines use these types of voicings on the top 3 strings, and you're really kind of, chunking away at it. Very, very common. These are also a really good voicing to use in melodic playing. It's very common to combine these very tight voicings in a melodic fashion and then follow it with a scale. That gets used all the time, and it really livens up a melodic line. A really famous example is a Tamakun by Rodrigo and Gabriel. I definitely want to look it up, you know. You know, I'm just kind of outlining. You know, I'm just outlining these triads, but you're using them in a melodic fashion, you know, and you follow out of the triad with a scale. It's a very good melodic gesture to use. Gets used in flamenco a lot, gets used in metal a lot. Just incredibly common technique, but you can use it in any genre where you're using soloing. Now, any type of finger picking that you do in pop music or folk music often uses these voicings. And in a way, these are kind of your standard cage chords to a certain degree, but there are other possibilities, there are other expansions on that basic idea that you're going to see a lot as well. So, like, one example is the outro to Leaves That Are Green that Paul Simon plays live. It goes a bit like this. Really, really pretty finger picking thing. And he's just using these triads, you know, over a D drone. And it's really, really pretty way to add to your finger picking. It's just a lot of these riffs just kind of fall into your lap and they sound amazing. Now, of course, going outside of just using them as triads in and of themselves, these chord shapes get combined with other bass notes to make you know, both different types of harmonies and also like finger-style polyphony. This happens a lot in R&B and in, you know, the kind of the folk pop of the 60s, like James Taylor and Carole King. You'll also start to get this a lot in modal jazz and in anything where you got a lot of voices moving around, like the you know, the triad voice starts to move around as sort of a voice of its own. And you really start to have to follow it against a bass line. But you can kind of do a lot of these things on solo guitar, too. You see Tommy Emmanuel doing lines like this all the time. It's one particular type of chord I call the hybrid dominant. It's a lot of people call it the James Taylor chord. It's kind of like the bass note of the 5 chord with a triad of the 4 chord. And this voicing gets used all the time. You know, it's like if you're like, you know, Shower the People. James Taylor uses that chord all the time. It's like chords like this are peppered all throughout Carole King's album Tapestry. And it's like winter, spring, summer, or fall. And she's just taking a bass note, triad there, and then another triad here, but keeping the bass note the same. So moving those triads around different bass notes, combining them with different sort of polyphony and counterpoint produces all kinds of really cool harmonic effects that you just get in R&B a lot too. It's just really, really nice way to add to the harmony. Now, of course, this shows up in classical music a lot because that's kind of where triads came from in an original sense. And if you take really famous pieces like Romanza, you know, it kind of coincidentally shows up. See, here's your triad right here, just a little finger, but you're playing a melody line around it. And if you can take that idea and expand it, if you can find notes around a triad, now you're starting to get into a whole nother field of playing. It gets written into a lot of classical pieces. You know, your triad just kind of end the piece. We've all heard endings to classical pieces like that, but once you start to hold those triads and start to play melodies around them and start to figure out how to kind of alter them to get other figures, okay, now you're getting into another ball of wax, which is really, really exciting and often easier than it looks initially. Now, of course, whenever you're playing like modal jazz and you're in a key, it's like kind of side-sliding the chords around a lot, you know? You know, you can kind of just play around with the chords in a key with a lot of modal jazz tunes, and also like this, there's a lot of melodic techniques from jazz and blues, like, you know, the side slides you get a lot. Those are much easier with triads. I mean, just in general, these chords move so much easier, like cage chords. Like trying to like move them around. They're just, you know, like, you know, it's so big and blocky by comparison that these triads are just, they have more of a melodic character to them. So when you're doing things like jazz or blues that can move very quickly, especially when melodic stuff is going on, these just give your fingers a platform to move much more quickly and to think a lot more. And the kind of the last thing I like to really get into, you can really do this in any style, but once you start to think around the triads, you can start to, you know, kind of come up with your own variations and expansions on them. You know, if you just take any old triad right here, I'm just playing a B minor triad with a bass note. finding notes around it, but you can start to make these sort of hybrid chords that are very close to the ones that you know. It's like, I can just create like a comping texture with that fairly easily, and all I'm doing is taking a triad, adding a note that's outside of it, and just, you know, just grooving over it. That's a really fun, easy way to take what you start to learn, and you start to find chords like this that are right next to a normal triad that you know, but they're so much more colorful. Once you start to use things like that in your comping, you know. There's just so much going on there that you can explore creatively. And your fingers find your way around this stuff a lot easier than they do a lot of other techniques, which take longer to master. There's a little bit of a learning curve to this stuff, but it's not as intense as something like sweeping or learning to do a lot more complex finger style stuff. I mean, I find especially when I use open strings, using drones a lot of time, or even shuffling around between open strings like you do in the blues a lot, oh my gosh, man, the possibilities open up so fast. And they're so flexible and so colorful and powerful and just grab your attention. That's why I'm crazy about this technique, and I think it's so worth learning. So this next couple of lessons, I'm going to start out by kind of showing you triad chord scales. You can kind of just learn what they are, just the mechanics of them. Once you've mastered the mechanics, I'm going to start to show you some of these applications, how to really get into them. And then last of all, I'm just going to suggest, you know, based on some of the things I've done, ways that you can explore uncharted territory with them, because they're just the reach of this technique is so wide that it's really hard to say anyone's kind of explored it all. So, I mean, it's fairly easy to find things that you can pull into your original music or just your original improvisations or what have you. That's the thing I'm really going to get into as the series goes on. So, I hope you guys dig this. I hope you find it helpful. Also, if you find these helpful, consider donating to me on Patreon or some other platform that I take donations on, because that's kind of what supports me doing this stuff. So give that some thought if you get a minute, and yeah, drop me comments if you got stuff you want to see or stuff you want us to talk about, and yeah, we'll see if we can get to it. Deuces, y'all. Have a good one.